As we move into the last half of 2 Timothy chapter 4, Paul is going to close out this letter discussing some personal matters, talking about some different individuals and things that Paul experienced, and also expressing a final closing greeting to Timothy. So we look here in 2 Timothy chapter 4, beginning in verse 9, where Paul says, "Make every effort to come to me soon. For Demas, having loved this present world, has deserted me and gone to Thessalonica. Crescens has gone to Galatia, Titus to Dalmatia. Only Luke is with me. Pick up Mark and bring him with you, for he is useful to me for service. But Tychicus I have left in Ephesus. But Tychicus I have sent to Ephesus. When you come, bring the cloak which I left at Troas with Carpus, and the books, especially the parchments. Alexander the coppersmith did me much harm. The Lord will repay him according to his deeds. Be on guard against him yourself, for he vigorously opposed our teaching." So Paul gets into some personal matters here in these verses that we just read. He first expresses this desire for Timothy to visit him soon. We see the human side of Paul and the relationships that he has with others, that there is a desire to see Timothy, but not just to see him. He also mentioned there in verse 13, he wants him to bring his cloak, which would be necessary for warmth. Later, he's going to talk about visiting before winter, so that's going to be a necessity. And also the books and the parchments, things that he would need for reading and writing, so that he could, as much as he could, continue his work and continue to be reminded of the things that he needed to have on his mind as he looked forward to what he just talked about, the reward as he neared the end of his life. So he says, make every effort to come to me soon. But then he talks about Demas. Demas, having loved this present world, has deserted me. He was formerly a traveling companion of the Apostle Paul's. In the book of Philemon, in verse 24, Demas is referred to as one of Paul's fellow workers. So he was one who was a companion. He was involved in the work with Paul. Previously, he had been an encouragement to him, but now it says that he has deserted him. Why did he desert Paul? Well, this wasn't some personality conflict that he had with Paul or some disagreement that they had. He says that Demas has left. He has deserted me because he loved this present world. It wasn't just that he didn't want to be around Paul anymore. It's that he was giving up on his faith. He was turning away from the Lord. This is a danger for all of us as Christians. Any one of us can do this. We can be faithful for a time, but then the world draws us back in, just as it did with Demas. John warned over in 1 John 2, verse 15, "Do not love the world, nor the things in the world. If anyone loves the world, the love of the Father is not in him." James would say over in James 4 and verse 4 that friendship with the world is hostility toward God. We cannot choose the world and be a friend of the world and love the world and still be faithful to God. Demas sadly made the decision he was going to desert not just Paul, but turn his back on the Lord because he loved this present world. Then Paul mentions certain individuals that had previously been with him, but now had left him not as Demas had, but were just gone to some other places. Crescens, he mentions going to Galatia, Titus to Dalmatia. He mentions Tychicus that he had sent to Ephesus. He was one of Paul's traveling companions he's mentioned in the book of Ephesians and the book of Colossians. So they had left, and he said that only Luke is with me. He was the only one who was still with Paul. So he wasn't completely alone, but you have these other ones who had previously been with him and supporting him, and now they're no longer around. This would make it more difficult for Paul, even though most of these individuals, Crescens, Titus, Tychicus, they weren't unfaithful. They didn't depart from the Lord, so it wasn't a discouragement in that way like it was with Demas, but they were not there to give Paul support and encouragement. Luke was there, but he was the only one. So Paul told Timothy that when you come, pick up Mark and bring him with you. This is important because he says that he is useful to me for service. we first read about this individual in connection with the Apostle Paul as he and Barnabas, Paul and Barnabas, are going on their first preaching tour, or their first missionary journey, as we sometimes call it. And they departed and went on this journey, but then John Mark turned back in Acts chapter 13 and verse 13. And later, when Paul and Barnabas decided they were going to leave and return and visit the churches that they had helped to establish, Barnabas wanted to bring Mark with them. And Paul likely didn't trust him not to desert again, and there was such a sharp disagreement between them that Paul and Barnabas departed and went two different ways. Barnabas took Mark with him. Paul ended up taking Silas with him. That's at the end of Acts chapter 15. But evidently, Paul did not feel like he could trust Mark in the work that he was doing. But now, Mark had evidently, through what he had done with Barnabas and whatever other information that Paul had received about him, he had proven himself to where Paul knew that he was useful. He was someone that could now be relied upon. And so Paul told Timothy, when you come, pick up Mark and bring him with you. So this is not only an example of forgiveness, where Paul was willing to forgive him, but also one of Mark demonstrating the fact that he is trustworthy now, that he made a mistake or he let them down before, regardless of the reason. But now he had demonstrated that he was able to help. He was able to be useful to Paul. And so Paul recognized that. So he told Timothy, you bring him with you. Then he warned him about an individual, Alexander the coppersmith. He says, you be aware of him because he zealously opposes our teaching. He said, the Lord will repay him. So there was that assurance. However, there was still a danger that existed to Timothy, where this individual could turn people against him. There could be problems with the authorities because of this, that their persecution could arise because of what this individual could stir up. He was opposed to the teaching and preaching of the gospel. Paul told Timothy, you be aware of this individual. He doesn't say stop preaching. He says, but you be aware of this individual and aware of the risks and what could be coming if you cross paths with this individual here, Alexander the coppersmith. Then Paul talks about the defense that he made and who was there to support him. 2 Timothy 4, verse 16. At my first defense, no one supported me, but all deserted me. May it not be counted against them. But the Lord stood with me and strengthened me, so that through me the proclamation might be fully accomplished, and that all the Gentiles might hear, and I was rescued out of the lion's mouth. The Lord will rescue me from every evil deed, and will bring me safely to his heavenly kingdom. To him be the glory forever and ever. Amen. So as Paul talks about his defense that he had to make, as he had to stand trial for preaching the gospel, he talks about his defense, and he says that at his first defense, no one supported him. All deserted him. But he says here, commendably, he says, may it not be counted against them. He was willing to forgive. He was not going to hold a grudge against his brethren, even though they let him down in this regard. However, even though his brethren had not stood with him, he says that the Lord stood with me and strengthened me. This is always going to be true. It was always true for Paul. It will always be true for us that even if others don't support us, even if others desert us, even if we have to stand alone, the Lord's still with us. And if we trust in him, we can gain strength from him to endure whatever persecution, whatever opposition, whatever challenges or hardships or trials or whatever it is we have to face. We can endure those things because he is with us. And Paul said that he had the confidence that the Lord will rescue me from every evil deed. Now, it's important that we understand what he does not mean by this statement. He said earlier in this chapter that he was already being poured out as a drink offering and the time of his departure had come, back in verse 6. He knew he was near death. So when he says here, the Lord will rescue me, he's not saying that the Lord is going to save him from death. It says he will rescue me from every evil deed. And what he is going to do is bring me safely to his heavenly kingdom. He would deliver him through every evil deed and save him as he went through death. That reward that he would receive, that crown of righteousness that he talked about in verse 8, because he fought the good fight, finished the course, and kept the faith, he was going to receive that. The Lord stood with him. The Lord would rescue him, not to prevent him from dying, but to preserve him and save him, that he would receive that reward. Then Paul closes the letter with these words: Greet Prisca and Aquila and the household of Onesiphorus. Erastus remained at Corinth, but Trophimus I left sick at Miletus. Make every effort to come before winter. Eubulus greets you, also Pudens and Linus and Claudia and all the brethren. The Lord be with your spirit. Grace be with you. So as we get to these final greetings that Paul gives to Timothy, he tells him to greet certain individuals. He mentions Prisca and Aquila, also referred to as Priscilla and Aquila. These were Paul's companions. Paul stayed with them and worked with them in Corinth at the beginning of Acts chapter 18. They are described in Romans 16 verse 3 as his fellow workers in the cause of Christ. And this individual, Onesiphorus, is mentioned earlier in this letter in 2 Timothy chapter 1 and verse 16, where Paul mentioned that he helped Paul despite the fact that Paul was in prison. This individual was willing to help him and was not ashamed of Paul's chains. He was not ashamed of being associated with him even though he was in prison. So Paul tells Timothy, greet these individuals here. He talks about certain individuals that were left in different places. Erastus remained in Corinth. He was mentioned in Romans 16 and verse 23 as the city treasurer there. So he was left there. He had likely responsibilities that he needed to take care of. He was left there. Trophimus, who was one of Paul's traveling companions, mentioned in Acts 20 and verse 4, and also the one who was with him in Jerusalem in Acts 21, that he was the one, because he was a Gentile, that the Jews, because they saw Paul with him in the city, supposed that, well, Paul must have took him into the temple, and that was the premise for opposing him, attacking him, and eventually having him arrested. That was Trophimus. He was left sick in Miletus. So he gives updates on these individuals of where they are. Then again, he talks about how he wants Timothy to visit him. Make every effort to come before winter. He said in verse 9, he wanted Timothy to visit him soon. He talked about how he wanted him to bring his cloak with him. This is a very practical thing that he mentions here. That he wanted to come soon. He wanted to bring the cloak so he have something to keep him warm dealing with the colder temperatures. And then there are greetings to Timothy from several brethren. And these ones are mentioned here and not mentioned elsewhere in the New Testament. But these individuals that otherwise we would not know who they were, but they're mentioned here in 2 Timothy, the end of chapter 4, as a record of them being faithful Christians, them being concerned about Timothy and sending their greetings as he was trying to preach the word. And then there's Paul's closing remark here. The Lord be with your spirit. Grace be with you. Timothy, as you work to fulfill your charge, to preach the word in season and out of season, to reprove, rebuke, exhort, to endure hardship, to do the work of an evangelist, to fulfill your ministry, the Lord be with you and grace be with you. And as we work to fulfill the Lord's instructions and His command and the charge that He's given us today, to preach the word, to endure hardship, for those who preach, to do the work of an evangelist, for all of us to fight the good fight, finish the course, keep the faith. As we do that, the Lord be with you and grace be with you.